We were going in schools, and what we were noticing that you sort of say, well, who understood or who didn't understand very much? And everyone's like, I don't know, we did the summative assessment. And so the piece that we felt that was missing was that evidence of understanding.
Welcome to Toddle's School Leaders Project. I'm your host, Cindy Blackburn, and today I'm talking with Tania Lattanzio. She's just written a new book all about how we assess conceptual understanding, and I'm so excited to dig into this. We know that we're responsible for understandings because we want students not just to have a bunch of disconnected facts and information, but to build understanding that they can transfer to their life within and beyond school. But a big question mark comes up. How do we assess that understanding? Yeah, we've got Project Zero's thinking routines, but how do we really know what students know and understand, and how do we get them to those deeper next levels? We dive into that in this episode, and you're not going to want to miss a single second, so let's jump right in. Tania Lattanzio, I'm so excited to have you here on the School Leaders Project. Thanks so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you, Cindy. It's an absolute joy to be here and absolute joy to reconnect with you again, that's for sure.
A note to listeners, Tania and I first met, she actually visited my school in Madagascar and led sessions there. And I was telling her before call that she's such an inspiration to me. So this feels like a full circle moment. But for anybody who hasn't followed your work or who doesn't know who you are yet, can you share who you are and the work that you do that you're most passionate about?
Yeah, no, for sure. So I'm Tania Lattanzio. I have a company called Innovative Global Education, and I'm an educational consultant. So I work with schools globally from early years all the way up. But the most of my work actually involves working with conceptual curriculum. So taking whether you're using standards and really creating conceptual units of learning that are worth learning, that put a focus on student agency, that put a focus on inquiry, and also put a real focus on the idea of moving away from content to really do students understand and what does that mean. And of course, with that means that, you've got to make sure you've got assessment in there, you've got to make sure you've got differentiation in there, and you've got to make sure that you've got inquiry in there, because the only way students can understand is to make sense of it. And so they've got to be the ones doing the work. And so that's a lot of my work in schools, has been going in there, planning with teachers, running workshops about concepts, running workshops about assessment for understanding, and reimagining curriculum to be more conceptually focused.
So cool. And we got to give some shine, some celebration, because you just published your newest book. You want to tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, so we've just published a new book called Leveraging Deep Learning, and it's strategies and tools for the assessment of understanding. And so it's a book that's really for teachers. I think one of the most important things is, well, this is what it's about, but how do we do it? And
Right.
so throughout the book, there are lots and lots of very practical tools and strategies that teachers can use that's going to help them move to assessing understanding. Part of the reason this came up, and I co-wrote it with Andrea Mueller, was because we were going in schools, and what we were noticing that you sort of say, well, who understood, a lot, or who didn't understand very much? And everyone's like, I don't know, we did the summative assessment. And so the piece that we felt that was missing was that evidence of understanding. So how do you actually know students have understood? And more importantly, how are you ensuring with students that you're building that and developing that understanding, that conceptual understanding over time, so they're constantly being challenged in their conceptual understanding and creating their conceptual schema. So it was, we just felt it was a piece that a lot of people hadn't yet thought about in terms of what that might look like. People were kind of jumping to a summative assessment without thinking, well, what is the evidence?
Mm-hmm.
What would that look like if someone understood that?
Well, and girl, you are so timely, because the learning progression, the learning continuums just came out from the IB, and
Yes.
each one of those subjects is broken into strands, and each strand has phase-wise conceptual statements of how we assess the concept. So I know there are going to be even more people asking the question, how do we assess conceptual understanding?
Yeah, because I think it's been something that's been missing. I think a lot of people are doing a lot of work on conceptual curriculum and creating units that are conceptual, but that assessment piece hasn't really come into it. And I think the other the other piece that to me is really, really important in the book is that we've really tried to put the learner at the center. And so whilst this is assessment, trying to ensure that we're involving students wherever possible in developing what that assessment might look like, in developing that criteria for understanding. We use what we call a rubric for understanding, which has 4 different levels that build up.
Oh,
But having
perfect.
students be involved in that process so they can really take far more responsibility, because it's like once students understand that criteria, they can then be the ones that are collecting the evidence as it's going along. And so there's a big emphasis on, students as assessment capable and students as self-adjusters. And then talking to students about, well, what do you think your next steps are as well? So really trying to make sure that we're putting students sort of in the center and that it's very much having them involved in their learning journey as opposed to having assessments done for them, doing assessments with them.
So cool. And within and with outside the IB, that is such a big question right now, is how do we
Yeah,
enter?
yeah.
But before we get ahead of ourselves, I really want to turn towards concepts because they're one of those things that we talk about concepts, we talk about understandings, but I think especially new teachers kind of go, and don't really know what we're talking about. So might you explain how you explain concepts in the most approachable way?
Yeah, for sure, absolutely. Look, one of the easiest ways to think about concepts is if I'm looking at a topic on a rainforest, for instance, and I've got this rainforest and I'm learning all the animals in the rainforest. I'm learning the different layers of the rainforest, for instance. So the living things that are there, the different layers there. What I'm doing there is I'm learning a lot of topical knowledge.
Mm.
When we talk about understanding, it's that idea that we want to see patterns, that we want to make connections, that we want to be thinking, and we also want transfer. So if I take that idea of a rainforest and now I start to look at it as a system and the interdependence within that rainforest, I'm now taking that idea of the different layers, the things that live there, but I'm connecting them. So how do they work together as a system? What is the interdependence? How do they rely on each other? Why do they rely on each other? So now I'm having to see connections, to make patterns. And the nice way to think about it is if I can understand a rainforest as a system and being interdependent, I can take that knowledge and transfer it to another ecosystem. So it's that transferability as well. So it's not just learning the what, it's understanding the why and the how, where students really need to go beyond just the content to why. And I think one of the most easiest things that teachers can ask themselves is, why am I doing this? Why is this important for students to learn? What is it actually about this that matters? And I think when you start unpacking that, that's when the concepts often will come out. And so, yeah, so it's moving away from just the knowing to really those concept words that help us understand. And I think the other joy about teaching conceptually is it really does promote those connections across the curriculum. I mean, if you're looking at systems, for instance, as a concept, there are so many systems that you can look at across the curriculum. And then what students do, again, they're able to transfer their understanding and have this far bigger understanding of what we mean by systems as opposed to looking at it just through a small topic. So it's the idea, do I know things, or can I do something with what I know? And
Yeah.
can I understand it? Yeah.
Well, it's almost there's a zooming out that happens there because you talked about the other subjects, right? So if I'm looking at systems and interdependence, I could look at that in science and rainforest.
Yes,
I could look at that in family systems and my family
absolutely.
system and interdependence. I could look at that in social studies and governments, right? So that transferability comes because we're able to zoom out and say, oh, this isn't something that only exists here. It's something I can
Yes,
see in other places.
absolutely. Absolutely. And when students start to make those links, I always talk about part of the reason you teach conceptually is because students get to blow your mind,
Yeah.
because we're allowing them to make connections that we may not even see. And that's the joy, because I think sometimes if we're teaching through this content, we're often boxing learning and sort of saying this is as far as you can go. Whereas once you open it up, there are so many possibilities for them to see connections that we may not have considered as yet. So it's I mean, I think it's important, and I do think it matters. And I think the other thing it does is it does give students that why are we doing this?
Right. It's so crazy. I just had like a flashback to teaching. I was student teaching in Florida, and we were learning about some very Florida specific history piece. And I remember one of my students made this bigger connection. And my co-teacher at the time clearly didn't understand it. It didn't relate to the topic at hand. And she was like, "Oh, you're just distracting us. You're just distracting the class." And I remember thinking, no, you just don't understand. You don't see the connection he's making. It's cool and it's big and it's
Yeah, yeah,
beautiful. But
yeah.
when you teach in that way, it gives students that voice to bring their own weird little worlds into what we're learning.
Yeah, and their experiences and so forth. It's very powerful. It's powerful learning when children start talking about what they understand.
So fun. Today's episode of the podcast is brought to you by Toddle, your all-in-one teaching and learning platform. If you're looking to assess differently, if you really want to capture what students know, understand, and can do, you really should take a gander at Toddle's assessment capability. Between AI-powered worksheets and portfolios, we have so many tools that make changing your assessment doable, actionable, and joyous. So check us out at ToddleApp.com. So we've touched on this a little bit. Um, but why do you think it's so essential in today's classrooms? I mean, we're thinking of AI, we're thinking of, the unknowable future. And why now more than ever is it important to learn conceptually rather than factually?
Well, I mean, you can look up a fact on AI in 2 seconds and you're going to get the facts. I think when we think about, if you're looking at the skills and the assets that we want students to have, so much of that comes about through students critically thinking, through reasoning, um,
Mm,
through making sense. And that's what understanding does. I can't make a student understand something. Like I can't make you understand. So
right.
whilst you've got chat GPT that you can find out everything, it's very different to understand it.
Right.
To understand it, you have to be engaged in learning to come to make sense of something. And so, a big part when we think about teaching conceptually is the way we approach that with students,
Hmm.
because they need to be doing the thinking. They need to be understanding. So we've got to really carefully be purposely planning to ensure that they're the ones that are involved in that learning. And so it changes, I think, a teacher from not that teachers do this as much anymore, but the focus comes off delivering content to, well, you've got to make sense of this. So I always talk about it, we're putting things in front of students for them to make sense of it and them to tell us. And I
Mm,
don't think you can get that from another source, because it's your thinking, you're creating that schema in your mind. And so when we think about a lot of those skills, I think it comes through developing understanding that we really want students to have, in particular critical thinking, analysis, all of those things that we know are really important, not only in school, but way, way past school as well. And of course, a big part of it's also, co-construction of meaning, where we want students to learn from one another to build their understanding as well. And so I think it's key. If we're still just teaching children a group of facts, we've got to be thinking about why,
right.
because they're now readily available anytime, at any moment. And so but it's not, I think there's this big myth, right? If you teach concepts, you don't learn facts. I
If you get
can't,
my question list in front of you.
you can't talk about understanding something without having some factual knowledge. I mean, you really can't.
Right.
But it's that idea that you're actually taking that factual knowledge, you're seeing connections, you're noticing patterns, you're reasoning about it, you're making theories about them. I mean, you're doing something with that knowledge that requires quite a lot of thinking.
I think it's so important to address that because that's a misconception I think that floats up. It's like, well, I'm teaching conceptually, so um, you know, facts are a dirty word
Yeah,
almost. And
yeah.
it's like you need something to build understanding with. And I think especially the newer, the science of reading movement is really putting an emphasis on our kids are kind of having a gap of facts and information. But what I heard you say there is it's just that that's not the ending point. It's that,
Yeah.
okay, let's do this at the beginning. Let's gather these facts. You gather some facts, you gather some different ones. Okay, now let's come together and move on to the next step, which is making meaning and putting it into our brains and making it make sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Because you again, I mean, if you want to understand the concept of exploration, you can't understand that without actually having dug into quite a few explorers.
Right.
And but you can't just do it through one. You need to actually be able to see, and you might be saying, okay, so after looking at all these explorers, this is why exploration happened, or these are the impacts. But because you're generalizing, and you can't
Mhm.
generalize through just one small fact. So I think actually what happens is you end up learning more.
Right. Yeah, well, because
Mm.
it's connected to something. It's not just
Yeah,
some
yeah,
weird isolated thing that you're
yeah,
memorizing. That's cool. One thinker I love in this space is Jay McTighe, and he said it in a way that really lingers with me, is he says that when we're thinking about knowledge, it's binary. Like,
yeah.
what dinosaur is this? Like, you know it or you don't know it, versus understanding happens along a continuum. And like
Yes.
you and I, because we're older, will have a greater depth of knowledge about exploration than a kindergarten would because we've had more
Yes.
experiences and we've read
Yes.
more things. So I guess that comes to the crux of your book is how do I measure if a student's understanding has deepened across a unit?
Yeah. And that's the key, I think, to it is making sure that we're then challenging students to do that as well. And so, when we think about it, it is a build up of understanding. It's not, it's not the rubric for understanding that we use as a tool to continually assess understanding is done around 4 different levels, and they each build up from one another. And
Cool.
we have command terms at each of the levels that people can use to write them. But the thing is, it's a level of understanding. It's not an activity. It's not saying So it might be like compare and contrast the interdependence within ecosystems, for instance, right? So
Okay.
you have to look straight away with that. You have to and explain similarities and differences, for instance. So straight away, you've got to look at 2 different ecosystems. You can't do that just
Mhm.
knowing one. And then that how you compare and contrast that. So we're trying to give students a lot more choice in how they evidence their learning as well.
Right.
Yeah, and so that's the understanding we're looking for. How you do that, and also I think then you've got that nice idea that not everyone's classroom might even be looking at the same ecosystems. You could be
Mhm.
looking at different ones. So it still opens it up to a lot of student choice, I think, and student inquiry. Because I think sometimes that's a fear when you have an assessment tool that you're taking away students' own interests, whereas I mean, to me, it's still embedded within that, which is so key and so important. In particular for motivation for learning, that students are getting a choice in some of the things that they're looking at in their learning.
Well, what's so funny about that is that command terms in themselves are essentially conceptual. Like
Yes.
compare and contrast, you might, as a teacher, default to a Venn diagram or an
Yes.
essay, but that doesn't necessarily need to be the case. It could be a museum exhibit. It could be a
Yeah.
video. It could be, there's so many different ways that
Yeah.
students might compare and contrast and what that might look like, but that there's common elements across the board
Yes,
of that.
exactly. Exactly. And I think that's the difference. When you move to understanding, you've got multiple ways to demonstrate that understanding.
It's cool.
Yeah, yeah. And so there's the 4 different levels that definitely build up from each other. And usually, if you're in a PYP school, we would be creating that around the lines of inquiry.
Cool.
MYP, that would be for each of the conceptual questions. And if you're in another school, it might be around your essential questions, or you might be calling them understanding goals, there's so many words for the same thing. But ideally, it's not the big generalization. It's breaking it up into those areas and ensuring that we're assessing along the way.
And use that same rubric for multiple understandings, like and is the goal for every student to be at the highest level understanding, or do you as a team say, okay, line of inquiry 1 is an inquiry into types of ecosystems, and that understanding we just kind of want surface. We just want them to be able to compare and
Yeah,
contrast.
I mean, I think if you're only looking for surface, types of ecosystem to me isn't a line of inquiry.
Right.
Yeah, because I think if you can't go across to challenge all students, then it's probably more of a content-driven line of inquiry or essential question than one that allows for real understanding to come out and be developed. Yeah.
But you use the same rubric for each
The
line.
same rubric, yeah. And there's different command terms because there are, some things require something quite different than others based depending on what that essential question or line of inquiry or conceptual question is. So there's sort of a list of different levels with those different command terms, and you're really thinking about which one makes sense within the context of this. Yeah. And again, if students can understand those command terms and you spend time unpacking them with students, they can be involved in writing that rubric.
Right.
Jamie House, sorry, who used to work at Coust, he used to do that a lot with his students. So they would write the rubric for understanding as a class.
That's cool. Is your rubric tied to Solo or Bloom's or another?
It's very, very similar, but it's whereas that's more about different types of thinking, because the way Bloom's is, it's not necessarily talking about it as hierarchical.
Right.
A lot of the time, whereas this is we're building understanding. So it's based on Webb's depth of knowledge. And
okay.
So his is quite a bit about also that idea of the engagements that go with that level of understanding as well. And that's the key, right? It's that idea that as educators and with our students, we need to be making sure that we're developing learning that's going to promote that type of understanding that we're looking for.
Very cool. I fear we nerded out too deeply there, but I really love that.
Look, I know I've planned it. I've used it with so many teachers, and once it's written, your planning is there. It just it stops over planning. Number one, it stops us doing a whole bunch of activities, because everything you plan really should be coming back to these levels. And so it makes sure that your planning is being purposeful to meet and build understanding over time. Yeah.
That's so clever, because I mean, obviously backward design is consistently what we've used, but typically when we go towards performance task, we gravitate towards skills and demonstration of knowledge. And then it's almost like the understanding is assumed we're going to do that like a reflection or something afterwards. But being intentional of saying, no, if we're assessing for understanding first, then the knowledge and the skills ideally you might need supplemental assessments for the skills or knowledge. Absolutely. A large part of that will take care of itself.
Sorry, my eyes really sore. Sorry.
Oh no,
it's just watery. I think it's just the aircon. Okay.
I'm just bringing you to tears with this joyous conversation.
Yeah, go on. Sorry. That can be locked out. That can be chucked out, by the way.
No worries. Cool. I love it. So I'm curious, Tania, about kind of setting the groundwork for this type of work. So are there mindsets, are there structures, are there habits that you find need to kind of be in place to get this work started?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think the thing is number one, you've got to be thinking about what do you value in terms of assessment. Right? Because, if you are valuing content, then that doesn't really work. So it's a shift in assessment practices. It's a shift also, I think, in the teachers doing the assessment to actually trusting and handing over to students to be far more involved in it. The other shift is, what I'm really encouraging teachers to do is, for each line of inquiry or whatever you want to call them, essential question, is to have a continuous assessment tool. So, for instance, you might have a line of inquiry and your tool might be a collaborative concept map that has 3 questions that students fill in throughout the unit. So they're adding to it in an ongoing basis. It might be that your line of inquiry is about going out and finding that concept. So, let's find it. Let's take a photo of it. Let's create a photo museum and explain how that concept connects to what we're looking at. And so just finding a tool that we can use on an ongoing basis where together with students, we can look at it straight away and go, wow, look how much you've understood already. As opposed to, I think, we're doing 2 check-ins. This idea that you're checking in continually and constantly. And I think the other shift is understanding that every moment is a moment for assessment. Assessment doesn't have to be this formal, like if you've had a conversation with a student and they've very, very clearly demonstrated this understanding, like that's evidence.
Hmm.
I think what's been happening is we're seeing that evidence has to be this written form all the time. And
Right.
so we're really trying to look at this idea of varied evidence, that it doesn't all need to look the same and everyone doing the same thing. Because if I'm not a good writer, maybe writing about my understanding isn't going to really truly display what I understand. So we're really trying to make sure that we're differentiating, and so that there is an entry point into that understanding for evidence of that in a variety of ways for students too.
That sounds like such a beautiful conversation to have with your teaching team. So to say, okay, let's look at this essential question. How might we know a student knows this? How might
Yes.
we know that they have a deeper understanding of this? And that there are, again, there are infinite ways for that to take
Yeah.
place. And that so often we do default to writing. And again, AI is kind of pushing this back on them, saying, maybe
Yes.
this
Yeah.
isn't as important of a skill as we thought it was.
Yeah, yeah. And of course, everyone needs to be literate. Of course they do. That goes
Right.
without saying. And everyone needs to be able to analyze writing and write well. That's not what people are saying. But I think
Mm.
it's often our deferment to assessments rather than thinking about other more creative ways sometimes. And that's the other joy about teaching conceptually, right? I mean, concepts can be you can visually express your understanding of a concept, whether you're using loose parts or whether you're drawing it or whether you're finding somewhere in the world that represents that photographically. And so you do have this opportunity to bring in far more creativity when you're thinking about concepts.
Mm. Is that a piece of the book? Is just kind of about evidencing conceptual understanding and like what
Yeah, yeah. So
how we
there's quite a lot of tools and examples of ways that you can evidence it. Just I like to, quite a few of them are for students. I like to put students in critique groups of around three, where
Mm.
if they feel they've got a piece of understanding, they go to that group and then they're evidencing that.
Cool.
So yeah, and so everyone's got to agree, because I think the big part of this that's so nice, it really allows for moderation of learning, because you're talking about it as a class the whole time. You
Mm.
used to say, what do you think this fits? What do we agree? What do we think? But you can't do that without having a really, really good climate for learning.
Yes.
That's the key, right? You've got to have that sense of community, that sense of no one's worried about where anyone is, everyone. So you've got to create that as a part of that as well, and build it up. Because if students have never done this, you can't sort of say, well, off you go, good luck. So it might start off that you're modeling it as a class, for instance, and you're just talking about it all the time and you're doing the collection. So it's that gradual
Mm.
kind of thing so students can understand, because we want them to be successful.
It's so interesting you mentioned that because I'm in the US now more, and I think so much of the assessment culture here is still such a power dynamic of
Yeah.
like the teacher owns assessment and the teacher owns assessment criteria. And I think this kind of assessment thrives when we have a culture of, hey, there's no mystery here. This is
Yeah.
what I'm looking for. This is what success
Yeah.
looks like. And how you demonstrate that, that's up to you. And hey, there's no shame. This is where you're currently at. You're not going to get penalized for it. We know that our goal is to get you here. Let's make a plan together. And I think a lot of that is the initial culture and foundational work that needs to be done before we can kind of pivot into this.
Yes, absolutely. It's that idea that I believe, right, that students should be involved in the assessment as well. That it's not me doing it to them; it's us doing it together.
It all comes back to that assessment capability.
It does. It does. It really does. But I mean, it's such a great skill for students to be able to have that chance to think about assessment, think about themselves as learners, be involved in that metacognition process for themselves as well.
Well, it's so empowering. I think like, even as an adult to have experienced that for the first time, again, coming from Florida public schools and standardized testing and achievement culture towards this, like, oh, it's not shameful to get something wrong and to be
Yeah.
curious about what I don't
Yeah.
understand yet. And to realize that, oh, Tanya really understands this better than I do. And I could ask her about it. Like that there's
Exactly.
such a
Exactly.
joy versus a shame culture
Yeah.
that comes from that.
Well, there's that lovely, where Dylan William talks about formative assessment, and he talks about students using each other as resources.
Right.
As a part of that, that's really what this is. It's that idea that, we're there for each other, and students should be using each other as resources.
Which you can't do. If the focus is achievement and competition and perfection, then
Yeah,
that
absolutely.
can exist.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, so important.
Yeah, it really is. It's a key to so much, though, that climate of learning.
Well, and in your personal life too, I just think for
Yeah.
all of us, it's like, it's that mirror, the beauty of like, your life changes as a person when you feel that for yourself for the first time. And that if we can share that with 11-year-olds or 8-year-olds and they can grow up knowing that, like, oh, it's amazing.
Yeah, incredible.
Life-changing. So we can't talk about concepts without talking about transfer. So
Yes.
might you talk a little bit about the importance of transfer and how we go about designing assessments with transfer in mind? Like, how do we know it's happening?
Yeah, look, I think a big part, there's a big chapter kind of dedicated to this, and so I've moved from using the word formative assessment to just continuous assessment. Like,
Smart.
this is happening all the time. And the other thing is I've stopped using summative assessment and instead use transfer and application.
Great.
Right. And so basically the way that I talk about it is that your last line of inquiry, essential question, conceptual question, should be your transfer. It should be there. And it's that idea that now that I've learned this, what am I actually going to do with it?
The so what?
The so what? Otherwise, why? So, for instance, if you've been learning about forces, how, your last essential question might be, how can I use my understanding of forces to create or innovate? Right. And then you're going to set very clear criteria for what you're expecting from that, for instance. If you've been looking at change makers, for instance, well, how can I bring about change in my community?
Mm-hmm.
And so always having that idea of, well, what is the transfer and application? I mean, if you've been looking at maths, for instance, and just, if problem solving, like, well, how can I effectively solve problems? I mean, that's transferable. And so you're always thinking of that so what as your last piece of that. And because, otherwise, like I said, we're just doing things. And it needs to be there, because what I find is if it's not there, it doesn't happen a lot of the time. That students don't get the chance to transfer and apply because of time or other constraints, whereas it's the most important thing. And the other thing is that transfer and apply doesn't always necessarily happen at the end. If you like, how can I promote sustainability in my community? You might start doing that early on. I mean, we don't know. None of these are saying that I want 25 of the exact same thing. They're all, you come to how you want to. And even the criteria is more about making sure they've got that understanding and you're very clear, but how they do it is really up to them. And so there's a big piece in the book about that idea of, taking it from, McTighe with their grasp tasks to a prac task. So it should be practical. It should involve students doing something and transferring and applying their understanding. And the other thing we talk about is, as much as possible, if you're looking at how we can build structures for a purpose, if you've been looking at structures, I mean, having people come in from the community who do those things. So we're connecting more to community. How can I promote well-being in my community? Well, who does that already? And so we're really trying to encourage that idea of having more connection to community by bringing people in who actually do these roles. And then that way students also see that what they're doing, it exists. It's not something that the teachers made up. So that's really, really, to me, that's probably one of the most important pieces of the book.
So do you see transfer and action as synonymous then?
Not always. I mean, because I think you can just transfer. For instance, if you were looking at transfer just within concepts, for instance, you could be looking at that idea, well, as we talked about with the ecosystem. So I can transfer my understanding to that, right? I can take it from here in this ecosystem and put it in here and put it in here and put it in here. So no, not always, because I think you can transfer without it. But to me, that action piece, that transfer and application really does give
Super
students more of
targeted.
the so what, about why they're doing it. You know, and I think a lot of it is having those questions or lines of inquiry, you know, really looking at them and thinking, are they transferable?
Right.
You know, because often they're so narrow that they're not necessarily transferable. You know, I was
And you
working.
play in science
Yeah,
and social studies, and they get kind of trapped into science and social
yeah,
studies. So it's
yeah.
again that zooming out.
Exactly, exactly. And so being able to sort of really think about where's the transferability there. And that's why sometimes, you know, they have to be quite broad, those lines of inquiry and those essential questions to allow for that transfer. You know, and it doesn't mean you just say, well, then we've got to cover our content. I'm like, well, yes. And you can have your teacher questions to match that, to make sure that you are looking at that content piece that you have to cover because of your scope and sequence documents, right? There
Right.
are people who have mandated scope and sequence that they have to teach, which is absolutely fine. But what we don't want to do is have it so narrow that we're stopping students taking it further and
Mm.
transfer. And so I think you can have transfer of conceptual understandings, absolutely, without the application piece. But what I'm trying to get teachers to do is to really think about the so what. Where's the transfer and application? Yeah.
That makes a ton of sense.
Yeah, and I also think I don't know, you know, we talk about this a little bit in the book as well, that so much of what we put out in front of children is such doom and gloom, right?
Yeah.
It's
Those
just,
fourth, third graders just learning about all their favorite animals going extinct. Yeah.
exactly. And so what we've really tried to do with that transfer and application is really come from a positive perspective. So what are solutions or what can I do? And but really rather than looking at it, you know, like let's look at the impact of people's use of resources. Let's look at solutions for people's use of resources as a line of inquiry or a question
Right.
rather than focusing on the negative. So really trying to be a little bit more solution orientated, and then that's where
Mm.
that transfer and application comes in. That because what's been happening quite a bit is you're asking students to solve problems that are so global and so big that they can't do it. Where this is really about, you know, where you are in the world. What could you do? What does this look like
Well,
for
it's the
you?
heart of agency of you
Exactly,
have the capacity
exactly,
to make a difference about the things you care about. And you can't
absolutely.
change everything, but in this little pocket of your world where you see this inequity happening, you can make that difference. So go.
Yeah, and then
Yeah.
you could transfer it to then go globally. But you know, I think it's. I was talking to someone the other day, and you know, talking to a group of teachers, and they're like, "Well, you know, they made a poster." I'm like, "Yeah, it was about food waste." They made a poster. I was like, "Yeah, but they could literally interview staff and come up with real solutions." And so
Right.
it's trying to move it from I'm letting people know to actually what can I do?
That's always I have, like, literally a slide in my deck that is like, "Action," and it's just a kid with a poster, "Reduce, reuse, recycle," because that is 90% of time when you talk to teachers, that's the action.
Yeah, I've really tried. So I think that, you know, just yeah, that transfer and application piece is so important to me. I think to give students purpose for why they're learning. Yeah,
So fun. Tanya, I think this can feel so hard. You know, like it's one of those things that the longer you spend unpacking concepts, the more it just like it makes sense and it resonates, and you see all the pieces. Your conceptual understanding gets deeper, but it can be hard to find an entry point when you're just getting started with this. So, what have you found? You know, what advice do you have for somebody just starting down this path, either as a leader or as a teacher?
yeah. Look, I think again, you've got to look at what you're teaching, and you've got to really just look at this and think, well, if I'm teaching this, what is really important about this? Like, why am I teaching this?
So what? Yeah.
Where's the so what? Like, what's the importance of this? And you've got to unpack that because as soon as you do that and you brainstorm around that, the concepts will start coming out. You'll be able to concept map out from that learning. But the problem is we don't interrogate our units often enough. What happens is we jump straight in and start planning them.
Right.
And we don't actually sit there and say, well, is this actually worth learning?
And we don't get excited about it and
And we
nerd
don't
out
get
about it.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And because the other thing you need to make sure is, you know, if you know, because a classic is right, you know, you often have a unit about beliefs and values. And when you talk to teachers, I was like, well, what are beliefs and values? They're like, oh, I'm like, yeah, no, you need to have a very collective understanding of
Shared
what those
language.
concepts are as a team before you start teaching them. So that's another thing that's really important, is that when you're saying, well, why are we learning this? What is really important about this? That you're all on the same page of what you mean by that as well.
Oh, I love that. I was talking to Tom Gusky, and he said it so beautifully that like your curriculum are the bones.
Yeah,
And that's great. It's so good to have a strong skeleton. Every kid needs to have a skeleton. But you, the teachers, and your passions and your interests and your quirkiness, you're the body. And
yeah,
that like you build the body around the bones. And that like you
absolutely.
need space and time to talk about that. And that
You
when
do, you do,
I
you
left
really,
every unit wanting to change careers. It's like we did our civilizations unit. I was like, I want to become a museum curator. Like we did our entrepreneurship unit. I was like, I want to become an entrepreneur. Like I think as the teacher, you need to be kind of that lead, just passion seeker.
yeah, absolutely. Because if you're passionate and excited about it, then that does rub off.
It does, and it could
That's
be anything. I made
absolutely.
beeswax wraps one year. I got really into it. The kids loved it. Like it's finding the things in your life that connect and opening that up and bringing it in.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the thing, when people, I always say to teachers, if you've got units that aren't conceptually driven at the moment, when it's not about throwing them out, it's reframing them.
Right. That zoom
So
out.
reframe, like you've got to reframe it to give it a conceptual lens and find that conceptual lens. Because you're right, like our curriculum's what we have, but it's or our scope and sequence, but it's what we do with that matters, and how we take that and put it into the learning and those experiences that we create for students to help them build that understanding. That's the joy, the craft of teaching, right? That's the joy of it.
I love it. Well, my friend, tell us one more time the title of your book and where we can find it.
Okay, I'm just going to grab a copy just because it's here. So here it is. So you can see it's called Leveraging Deep Learning Strategies and Tools for Assessment of Conceptual Understanding. And it's available through Elevate Books.
So cool. I
And
think it's
it's
such a necessary
lots
book.
of, yeah, lots of examples. And there's lots of opportunities within the book. It's a great book for book study because we've given lots of opportunities for teachers to transfer and apply with tools there to do it. And it's also full of teachers' voice about how they've found trying some of these things and their journey into the ideas as well.
So fun. Well, I always come away from conversations with you just inspired and delighted. So thank you so, so much for your time today, Tania.
Oh, thank you, Cindy. It's been so lovely to reconnect. I really do appreciate it. And yeah, and I hope, if you do buy it and you find the book useful, please do let me know. It's always nice to know how people find the work that you put out there.
Oh, I totally will.